Hello and welcome to this presentation on basic fundamental principles of economics according to the School of Classical Economics. I'm your presenter for this uh, introduction. Um, let's waste no time and let's get into it. So there are a few basic concepts to go over with regards to classical economics. So these are aggregate demand, aggregate supply, gross domestic product, and the price level. And these are the kind of the basic core concepts that really, to understand certainly classical economics, one has to get their head around. They're quite simple, and we will be going through them throughout this lesson. But these are basically the key principles that need to be understood. So we start off with aggregate demand, which is probably arguably the most important factor in an economy, which is the level of demand in an economy for the goods and services that are produced. So this is the level of how much the goods and services produced in an economy are desired and purchased by the consumers. It's how much the consumers, both at home and abroad, um, want to buy the goods and services of the economy. Now, this is calculated in a number of ways. So, there are four key factors that go into determining the level of aggregate demand. The first and generally the largest um, factor in levels of aggregate demand is the expenditure by consumers. So this is everyday people going out and buying things from the shops or whatever it might be, and their expenditure on goods and services in the economy is is represented by C here, and is usually, generally speaking, it's the biggest element of the aggregate demand equation. Next, we have capital investment. That is the investment by companies into the economy, so in expanding their um, business enterprises, expanding, the facilities they have to make products and so on, like factories and whatnot. That comes under the remit of capital investment, um, because and that is an important factor because that usually represents, again, very large sums of money being dished out to a lot of people, um, which has what we call the multiplier effect, which we will go through in probably the next lesson. Um, but capital investment, yeah, is an important part, but it's generally smaller than the spending by consumers, simply because of the fact that it happens less frequently, so it's kind of less reliable, and companies may spend more on a single investment than consumers spend on a single amount of shopping, but it's less frequent. There's less companies spending, basically. Then we have government expenditure. And obviously, this comes in a variety of ways. Um, Government expenditure, it can serve as a form of capital investment, so investment in infrastructure projects, for example. It also just comes from paying, for public services, which pay people's wages and obviously pays for certain goods and services that are needed by the public sector. So that obviously builds demand. And now, arguably the most complicated part of the equation is this x minus m element. Now, it's quite simple, really. It is simply the volume of exports subtracted by the volume of imports into the economy. So it is essentially the overall level of trade in the economy. If there is a greater amount of exports from the economy to foreign countries and foreign consumers, it will have a positive effect on aggregate demand. if there is a greater amount of imports coming into the economy, it will suppress aggregate demand, because the total outcome of x minus m will be negative, and therefore it will have a negative effect on the equation. So that's the equation for aggregate demand. We've got consumption by consumers, capital investment, government spending, and then exports minus imports. Once we've figured out our level of aggregate demand, we plot it on a graph as shown here on the right. Our base point we represent with AD1, so we draw that in the middle of the graph, and that represents the kind of the basis point from which we are measuring our changes in aggregate demand. So as you can see here, aggregate demand can either shift left or shift right. A shift to the left on the graph of aggregate demand represents a shrinking level of demand, and a shift to the right of aggregate demand obviously represents a growth in that demand. Now, on these graphs we have two axes. We have the general price level and the level of real GDP. We'll come on to what price level and GDP specifically mean in a little while, but what needs to be understood is that aggregate demand has an impact on the real GDP of the country and also on the price level of goods throughout the economy. And that is the average price level, of course. And that is and we find that out when by including the next facet of the economy that we need to talk about, which is, of course, aggregate supply. So aggregate supply, much like aggregate demand, is the measure of the level of supply of goods and services within the economy. So obviously if people are demanding goods and services, there has to be a supply to meet that demand. So the way we figure out the GDP of an economy and the price level, the average price level within in an economy, is by plotting the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply on the same graph and finding where these two lines intersect. This allows us to find the equilibrium level of output for the entire economy, which is the GDP, as well as the equilibrium price level for the entire economy. Now, as I mentioned before, aggregate demand can shift left or right, and aggregate supply can do the same. It's not represented on this graph here, but it works in much the same way. So if there is a decrease in supply, but demand stays the same, then that curve will shift left and the price level equilibrium will increase, while the GDP output has decreased, because it will move further up the aggregate demand curve. What that means is that if there is not enough supply for a good, your economy will shrink because the demand isn't being sated. So basically in that scenario there is an excess demand that is causing prices to rise and is actively hampering the size of the economy. But we will come on to things like price level and GDP. Speaking of, we now have the gross domestic product. As I mentioned, this is measured by the point at which aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect in this previous graph. It is the measure of the total output of goods and services within the economy, and it's a measure of the amount of money flowing through the economy. So you'll often see GDP measured in terms of dollars. So, you know, the American GDP is however many trillion dollars. And that is a measure of the amount of money that is flowing through the American economy year on year. And the way that this flow of money works is represented here by this diagram. So the main two factors that drive the flow of money around the economy are the consumption by households and consumers of goods produced in factories and by companies and so on. So what that means is that people buying goods transfer their money that they have to the company by buying these goods. Now, these companies obviously they use that money to pay wages, and these wages are fed back into the households, who then use the money they have earned in these wages to buy products, and as a result you have this flowing cycle of money constantly going around the economy. Now, there are other factors that can inject more money into this cycle, or can extract money from this cycle. So when we're looking at ways that money can come out of the economy, there are three main areas. First of all is savings. So obviously when a household is paid a wage, when a person is paid a wage, generally speaking, they will set aside some money every month as savings, as kind of, a rainy day fund, or maybe they're saving for a holiday. Doesn't really matter what. So they will set aside some savings. Now and they will keep it in their bank account accruing interest. That is money that is not being spent in the economy. So it means that money is coming out of the cycle of money, which means that it is negatively impacting GDP by saving. It's not to say that saving isn't important, but obviously the importance of the interests of macroeconomics don't always align with personal economics. So yeah, savings, and people put money in the bank, they aren't spending that money, and therefore that money is not being included in the flow of money. Next we have taxes, which are of course levied by the government to pay for public services. Obviously when the government taxes you, it is taking money from your wages and is therefore reducing your ability to use that money to pay for goods and services. So that money, that when taken, in the moment that it's taken as taxes, that money has been taken out of the economy. Now of course taxes themselves can then be reinvested into the economy in a number of ways, and we'll come on to that. But in the immediate instance of taxes being levied on income or whatever it may be, that is money being taken out of the flow and therefore suppressing GDP. And lastly, we have imports. So as mentioned, imports are a factor in determining aggregate demand, but they are also important with regards to the cycle of money, because imports are obviously goods and services from a foreign country, from a foreign economy, that has been purchased by people within the domestic economy. And what that means is that the money from the domestic economy is being sent out to the foreign economy instead, to another country's economy, and other countries' businesses. So therefore, when you buy a good from, say you were to buy a phone from China instead of a phone made in Britain, or wherever it is you might live, you are taking that money out of your country's economy and putting it into the Chinese economy instead. So therefore that money is being taken out of the flow of money that determines GDP. Now, on the flip side, there are three ways, external ways, which can inject money into the economy and boost GDP. Government spending is one of the major external factors that boosts the economy. So that can be government spending in infrastructure projects, can be government spending in mainly infrastructure projects, but also, say, expanding technology, so like updating the systems of the healthcare system or whatever it might be, any kind of government spending basically. Now this obviously mainly comes from taxes. Some of it can come from borrowed money as well, but generally speaking it mainly comes from taxes that have been levied. But government spending is a massive injection often of cash into the economy. And what this does is that obviously government spending itself produces wages, but what government spending does is that when the government begins an infrastructure project, for example, let's take, for example, a high-speed rail line. If the government were to begin funding a high-speed rail line, they would need to hire out construction firms, they would need to hire out consultants, lawyers, they would have to buy the materials necessary to actually build the track, they would have to hire people to design the new trains, etc., etc. Now all of that involves the government spending money on companies, right? And these companies then, they take that money and then they pay people to work on these projects. So the government is spending money to generate more wages, basically, and add more money into the economy, into the flow of the economy, because then those wages are pulled through and spent on goods and services again, so on and so forth. So that's an injection of money into the flow of money. This is what we call the multiplier effect. It's where an investment into the economy, as it goes through the economy, actually has a multiplicative impact on the actual GDP and growth of the economy, basically, because it's filtered through so many different levels of wages and purchasing of goods and services and so on. The next is investment, so that is private investment, and again that works very similar. That's a very similar case to government spending. So that is private companies looking to expand their factories or whatever. That means they have to buy resources. It means they're hiring new people to fill the extra jobs that they're creating. So that means a growth in wages, which means a growth in the amount of money flowing through the economy. And lastly, we have exports, which is the opposite case of imports. So when a company is exporting goods and people abroad in foreign countries are buying the goods and services of your country, they are giving those domestic companies money, and that money is coming into the economy to pay wages and so on and so forth. That is the opposite side to the extractive problem of imports. Exports are that extraction of money coming into the economy, basically. Next we have the price level. Now again, much like GDP, price level is measured by the intersection of aggregate demand and supply, and it measures the average price level throughout the economy. So again, you will take a base year that you work off of, that will represent the point at which you are measuring everything else from, and you will compare price levels to that base year as aggregate demand and supply intersect, and that was how you will measure the differences between them and how price levels have changed, if they have grown, if they have shrunk. However, with aggregate supply is a bit more complicated than aggregate demand, because there are two kinds of aggregate supply. So there is short-run aggregate supply, which is represented with the diagonal aggregate supply lines, so the AS1 and the AS2 on this graph. Those are the short-run aggregate supply. And then we have the long-run aggregate supply. Now, the difference between short-run and long-run aggregate supply is that the long-run aggregate supply represents the overall general capacity of the economy, of supply within the economy, whereas short-run aggregate supply represents the short-term output of supply in the economy. Now, short-run aggregate supply can outstrip long-run aggregate supply, but in the long run it will always return to the long-run aggregate supply, of course. as the kind of the extra resources that are used to maintain that short run aggregate supply level are exhausted. Um, so this could be, for example, say there was like a new vein of coal found somewhere. That would boost the short run aggregate supply, but if it was quite a short, if it was quite a small supply of coal, the long run aggregate supply wouldn't shift. So in the short term, while that extra coal is being used, the aggregate supply and the price level and the output of the economy would shift to the short run intersection with AD, with aggregate demand. But when that supply, as that supply of coal is exhausted, it would revert back to the long run aggregate supply as the kind of general median. So generally speaking, prices always settle in an economy according to the long run aggregate supply. So that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. It can mean that, you know, if there is a short term increase in supply, that over time prices will increase back to the median, or if there is a short term drop in supply, prices will decrease back to the median, basically, as the issues are in the economy are resolved. And a good example of that could be, for example, a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. That would reduce the short run aggregate supply, and therefore send prices up. But in the long run, obviously that ship is going to get cleared, and so prices will return to normal as the long run aggregate supply comes back into play. Now it is possible to boost the long run aggregate supply of the economy. This is done via what we call supply side policies, which are policies designed to increase the productive capacity of the economy. This is done in a few ways. Arguably one of the most famous, some of the most famous supply side policies are tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. That's in neoliberal economics leans heavily on supply side policies to boost the economy, and that is the main tool they use to boost the supply side. The effectiveness of it as a policy is questionable, but there are other ways to boost the supply side of an economy. That is by improving the infrastructure and connectivity of an economy. So by increasing the quality of broadband, making people more connected, increasing rail connections, lots of things like that that make it cheaper and easier to travel or to communicate or to deliver goods around the country. They all boost the long run aggregate supply of the economy, because the capacity of the economy to grow has grown, because it is easier to expand as, say, a business if it is cheaper to transport goods around the country. It means you can sell more goods to to a wider audience, and therefore, as a company, you will have more money to expand. So that's what we mean by the long run and the short run aggregate supply. And then, yes, where these intersect is how you determine the price level. Now, price level is more commonly referred to as inflation, and the most common method for measuring the level of inflation in an economy year on year is through what we call the Consumer Price Index. Now, this Consumer Price Index, this CPI, is represented as a basket of goods that are purchased by consumers. So the core items that households are spending their money on throughout the year. So obviously that's obvious things as shown here: housing, food and drinks, transportation, medical bills, education. All these kind of things that people have to buy regularly, and this is measured in changes year on year compared to a base year. Much like aggregate demand and supply compared to a base year, so is inflation and the CPI. And generally, it is targeted that inflation is targeted by central banks around the world to be about 2% every year. About a 2% growth in prices every year is considered um, a healthy level of price growth. Now, prices obviously grow as demand grows and supply doesn't necessarily uh, meet the demand. Um, but there are other factors that influence inflation and price growth, such as the general amount of money within the economy. Obviously, that it lowers the value of the money itself and therefore raises prices. So the most important thing with CPI and inflation is that it is contrasted to the level of wage growth in the economy as well, because inflation contrasted with wage growth is how you understand the changes in standard of living. Because obviously, if wages aren't growing at the same rate that inflation is, then that means that that consumers are able to purchase less with their money. So they may be getting a wage increase. So say wages were to increase 5% one year, but inflation increased 10% in one year. That would mean that despite them having more money, consumers can actually buy less with that money. Um, and as a result, standard of living falls. If wages outstrip inflation, so say there's an inflation rate of 5%, but wages have grown at 10%, um, they can buy more despite their high level of inflation. Consumers can buy more, and therefore standard of living will increase. Now, obviously, a 5% level of inflation would bring with it a whole slew of other problems, mainly to do with the production side, the impact on companies and so on, who would likely then not be able to produce as many goods, um, and would have to raise prices and so on and so forth, and that would cause a kind of spiralling effect of inflation. But that's just an example. So at the end of this lesson, to recap, um, gross domestic product and price level are the fundamental measures of an economy's size and affordability and prosperity and kind of standard of living within an economy. And these are found at the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is split into the two kinds of aggregate supply. There's the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply, where long run aggregate supply is the kind of maximum productive capacity of the economy in the long term, and the short run aggregate supply is the short term capacity of the economy productively. As I mentioned, inflation and price level are key determiners of the standard of living within the economy. So a high level of inflation and large increases in the price level would generally represent declining standards of living, and this is brought about generally by inflation and increases in the price level are generally brought about by increased demand without the supply to meet it. Whereas if demand were to fall and supply were to stay the same, prices would fall. So generally speaking, we have what's known as demand pull inflation, where the price of goods and services is increasing because there's more demand than there is supply. And finally, we have the gross domestic product and the cycle of money. So GDP is generally considered a measure of the amount of money flowing through the economy, and this is calculated through the cycle of money. So how the consumption by households of goods and services enriches companies, who then pay wages to households and consumers, who then continue that cycle by buying more goods and services. And there are some key factors that draw money out of the cycle of money, so savings, taxes, and imports. And then there are key factors for injecting money into the economy, so government spending, capital investment, and exports. And that is all for this kind of introductory lesson to classical economics. I think we've gone over the key basic concepts that need to be understood to understand economics. If there are any questions, obviously please leave them in the comments and I'll try and answer them. And then in lesson 2, in the next lesson, we will go into further detail on probably some of the elements that we have gone through here. So maybe a bit more detail on aggregate demand and supply. If you have any recommendations for what to do in lesson 2, please leave them below in the comments. But that is all. Thank you very much, and I hope you found this enlightening.